Welcome to the Exploress, time traveling through women's history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. A woman stands tall against a frigid wind, looking out over a mist-shrouded fjord. Her husband and his men have been gone a long time, sailed off across the seas in search of plunder. She spent many years helping to weave the sails that bore them away to glory. In his absence, though, someone has to keep the farm running, tend to wounds, raise the children, and work the difficult land. But this woman, this queen, must do much more. She manages the affairs of the entire community, and she protects them. It's not an easy life, but it's one in which this woman more than holds her own. We hear so much about the lives and epic battles of Norse men. But in this series, we're going to sift through the mists of time to try and find out what life was like for women in the Viking Age. Lucky for us, we have two special guests on this journey. Eleanor Barraclough, a historian and broadcaster whose book Embers of the Hands explores what life is like for everyday Vikings, and Nancy Marie Brown, who's been studying and writing about Vikings, warrior women in particular, for decades. So, grab your loom, your favorite axe, and a flagon of mead. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of our patrons. My warrior queens, MCF, Gail, Christina, Sarah, Amanda, Ika, June, Neve and Sloan, Kate, Jessie, and Alexis. My imperial empresses, Sally, Letitia, Teresa, Samara, and Faye and Whimsy Soapworks. And my lady pharaohs, Kimberly, Lori, Cheryl, Kat, Laura, Bridget, Sophie, Kate, and the fabulous Courtneys. Other than listening and sharing, there's no better way to support this show than by becoming a patron. You'll get access to bonus episodes, including full interviews with both of our guests and extra Viking stories. To find out all about it, just go to theexploress.com and click on Become a Patron. Before we dig properly into life for the average Viking lady, we need to have a heart-to-heart about our sources. Studying the history of the people we call the Vikings looks very different than many of the other times and places we've traveled. Why? Because we just don't have that many written sources to analyze. The Norse had an oral culture. They never wrote down their own history. So how do we even know what we think we know? It's important to note that a lot of written sources come from the people the Vikings raided/terrified during their travels, which is going to understandably color everything they have to say. Case in point, the Vikings didn't actually call themselves that. The word, we think, comes from the Old Norse term vik, which means a bay of the sea. The Vikings were quite literally bay people, a reference to their tendency to hang out in bays whilst out on raids. Here's Eleanor.
Viking, there's an Old Norse version of the word vikingur, which means raider or pirate. There's also a version of it that means sort of to go on a Viking, to go on a raid. At the same time as that word's being used, and we'll talk about that, there's a version in Old English, which is the language spoken in a lot of England at that time, Viking, which also means pirate. It doesn't specifically mean Scandinavian at that point, but it comes to mean that.
The word vikingur describes an occupation, not really a culture or identity. To Viking is in some ways a verb, meaning to raid or even to travel. Our contemporary sources called them, more or less, raider bay pirates, because to them, that's exactly what they were. The Vikings, who we will also be calling the Norse, traveled far and wide, which means we have a lot of written texts about them. Frankish, German, English, Arab, and Byzantine accounts. And that's great, except that oftentimes these people were writing about the Vikings to emotionally deal with the destruction they wreaked. No surprise, then, that these accounts aren't overly flattering. It's not as if you're going to stop in the middle of a letter about how a bunch of fair-haired warriors pillaged your monastery to describe exactly how they combed and wore their hair. Here's Nancy.
On the European front, in Latin, the people who wrote about the Vikings were not only their enemies, they were firmly Christian, patriarchal men, probably all men, we don't know, but probably all men, and certainly not interested in women's lives. And when you look at the Icelandic sources, yes, we have a lot of stuff written in Icelandic about the Viking Age, most of it fiction, the sagas, but there's historical information in there. But there's maybe one saga that we think might have been written by women, and even that's debatable. So the women's lives are a big sort of shadowy area, and they always have been.
It's also worth keeping in mind that these guys are only describing a small sliver of the people we call Vikings, the ones who go abroad a raiding, not so much the ones who were farming back at home. So we can't rely too heavily on these contemporary accounts for an accurate picture of Viking life. So what do we turn to? We have some legal documents, like land grants and legislation, but these were usually written by Christian scholars about a century or more after the Viking Age, and of course we have to account for biases there. We also have the Icelandic sagas, hundreds of Old Norse stories written down by Christian authors in Iceland in the late 1100s, more than 100 years after the end of the Viking Age. These sagas generally fall into two categories: the family sagas, which focus on individual families and are full of feuds, revenge, love, and war. You know, the good stuff. And the legendary sagas, which feature battles with monsters, cursed witches, and magic. So we've definitely got a mix of fact and fiction on our hands here. Finally, we have the Icelandic poems, which are even older than the sagas, and may be the most historically accurate written sources we have.
So the sagas are written down in Iceland in sort of the 13th century onwards, but they have older oral roots stretching back in time. And there's a particular group of sagas called the Íslendingasögur, which means the sagas of Icelanders, which are very much sort of often quite soap opera style tales of the first generations of Icelandic settlers. They're absolutely wonderful. And there is historical truth in there. There are going to be real figures in there, real stories, people's ancestors. But of course, as they're passed down over the generations, stuff's going to be added to them. Stuff's going to be left out. You know, things will be embellished. And so the thing is, it's very hard to take them in a way that means we can distill fact from fantasy and say, right, that bit's rubbish. Although sometimes it is. Sometimes it's a dragon. And you can be like, all right, that's cool. We'll put that on the rubbish pile in terms of our historical. But when we're looking at what's real, that's harder.
The majority come from the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, and they are the foundation for everything we know about Norse mythology. These are the tales of the gods and goddesses like Freya. In the Viking Age, it was literally someone's job, called the skald, to compose, memorize, and perform the poems. These stories were all told orally, which means they likely evolved as they changed hands over time. And then, in the 13th century, comes a guy named Snorri Sturluson. He spoke with scholars and skalds, studied genealogies and history, and copied out thousands of poems and stories painstakingly, line for line, many of which had never been written down before. But we've got a bit of a problem when it comes to our friend Snorri.
His intelligence, his perspective on life is really the biggest insight we have into what life was like for people back in that time. And as I learned by studying his life and his times and his family, he didn't like women at all. He did not have any relationship with his mother. He was separated from his mother when he was 3 years old. His marriage was arranged for him by his brother. He didn't like his wife. His wife did not like him. They separated after a few years. He had a couple of love affairs, that had children. He may have actually fallen in love once because we have a love poem. That woman may have died, we don't know. But then he married off his daughters for political gain. When they tried to come home, he shoved them back out and married them off again. So he's not like a really good source for what it was like for women living in the Viking Age, and yet he's the one that we have to rely on.
Another important note about Snorri, he was also writing mostly to gain influence with the young boy king of Norway at the time. And because that king was being raised by Christian bishops, he infused many of them with Christian values. He was also a massive misogynist, and the sagas reflect that. The majority of his characters and heroes are men. But even so, there were many powerful women in Viking history and legend that even old Snorri couldn't ignore.
These men who wrote these stories left out a lot of women. They weren't interested in women. They were writing men's histories. And yet they couldn't leave these women out because they were that important. These queens were so important that they had to be mentioned they couldn't leave these people out, even if they disliked them. So that tells you something.
So there are plenty of texts about the Vikings, but none of them can be read as gospel. Fortunately, we do have some written evidence we can rely on: runes.
They're those spiky letters. That's the main thing. Some of them look quite familiar to anyone who uses a Latin script to write, for example, English. And that's probably no coincidence, because it's possible, not definite, but certainly possible, that the runes develop as a writing form in response to the Roman Empire, which is sort of the major political and cultural entity, certainly in the centuries that are leading up to the Viking Age. Now, Scandinavia is never part of that Roman Empire, but certainly there's a lot of contact. And there are, warriors, for example, auxiliaries coming down, to join that part of the Roman army from Scandinavia, and particularly Denmark. And when they come back, they're bringing all sorts of accoutrements of the Roman world. That could be weapons and armour, but it's also cultural things, and writing is one of them. And that might explain why the word rune seems to be connected to a meaning that means something secret, something hidden.
These are the only written sources the Vikings left us: angular signs designed to be easily cut into stone or wood. The Scandinavian runic alphabet had 24 signs in earlier centuries, but the Vikings used a later form of the alphabet, which had only 16 signs. Each could be used for multiple sounds, and might sound different depending on which regional dialect you spoke. But sometimes it's difficult for us to determine how they should be spoken. Vikings weren't literate in the modern sense, but the majority of the Norse could read runes, and some could even write them. There were runes associated with magic, written for things like protection in battle, healing, childbirth, or safe passage overseas. Fun fact, Bluetooth is actually named after a Viking, Harold Bluetooth, and the Bluetooth symbol is an Old Norse rune. Most runes were carved into rocks and served as memorials to the dead, traced genealogies, or recorded legal codes. Helpful, sure, but not always a clear or super detailed picture. Archaeologists have also found small wooden slips in Viking trading towns that were clearly used for things like shopping lists, merchant tallies, even love notes. One such slip reads,
"Ingeborg had sex of me when I was in Staffordshire."
Good for you, Ingeborg. We hope you had a blast. And then there is this fun little telling off from a wife to her husband.
Now, my absolute favourite runes actually come from right at the end of what we might think of as the Norse or the Viking Age. And it's when everyone's basically using runes, but using runes the way you might send a text message or write a post-it note. So, they're no longer secret, they're no longer hidden. People write their names, people write gossip, people write poems, people write love notes. My favourite is a woman called Gyða, and she seems to be writing this little rune stick in around 1200 in Bergen in Norway. And it seems likely that she's sending a message to perhaps her husband, who's down at the pub because this rune stick was sort of found in a location where there were lots of taverns down by the waterside. And this rune stick simply says, Gyða says you should go home. And she's basically calling him back from the pub. And there's runes on the other side that are completely unintelligible. And it looks like he's tried to maybe carve a message back to her, but it's like the equivalent of a drunk text message, right? There's nothing coming through.
But most of what we know about everyday life for the Norse comes from the study of material culture and the archaeological evidence they left us. This series is coming to you in large part courtesy of burial mounds, ancient fortifications, and sexy sunken ships. Historians have analyzed the wood, metal, clay, animal fur, textiles, bones, teeth, and DNA from thousands of Viking graves, and they've been able to piece together a portrait of Viking life for us. But a lot of what we know, or what we think we know, depends very much on who's doing the interpreting. And that can be a problem when we're talking about women's lives.
Back in 1878, the archaeologist said, "Oh, we have a burial with weapons. That means it's a male." That was what they did back then. A modern archaeologist who did her dissertation in the last 25 years, she calls it sexing by metal, because they look at the metal in the grave and they determine the sex based on if it's weapons, it's male. If it's jewelry, especially the brooches, oval brooches or box brooches that would hold up the straps of the woman's dress, then it must be a woman. So very easily to classify those things. And now looking at all of the graves that are listed in catalogs as male, you have to wonder, on what evidence did you decide that this was male?
Alas, a lot of the things they've found in these bogs and burial mounds are incomplete, decayed, and degraded. Modern science can only work so many wonders.
To tell if a person is male or female, if you have certain bones, and if you have a large enough population of people buried in the same place, in the same soil, at about the same time, you can classify those into the male bones and the female bones based on differences in the pelvis mostly, but also in the skull. If you only have a single pelvis, though, you can't compare it to a population halfway across the world, because different groups of people are built differently. So a pelvis that looks female in one society might look male in a different society. So it's really hard to say that, as they, as archaeologists are taught, as they taught me, the women's bones look smoother, rounder, and more slender. But compared to what? If you don't have people of both sexes in your same graveyard, you can't really compare. Next problem. The bones are degraded. After 1,000 years in the soil, they break down. So you don't really have a lot to look at. You often don't have all the bones you need. And then in many of the Viking societies, because this was not one, Viking society, this was lots of different little cults and lots of different little ways of burying people. Sometimes the bones were burned, and then they were crushed, and then they were stuck in a grave. So how's an archaeologist supposed to sex that grave? Well, if there's a weapon in it, it's male. So if you look at the catalogs, that's what it's going to say. So this is something that has been plaguing our understanding of women in the Viking Age ever since archaeology started.
So really everything, or much of, what we're about to discover on this time-traveling journey involves some guesswork and conjecture, and definitely some myth-busting. But the Exploress does love a challenge. The word Viking usually conjures images of giant, blonde-bearded men with axes who hail from somewhere icy and cold. But a Viking, historically, is anybody, man, woman, or child, who lived in Scandinavia, or present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, from the mid-8th century to the mid-11th. The Vikings were epic travelers. They also had strong cultural presences in other Nordic countries, including Finland and, of course, Iceland. But they travel much, much farther.
People sometimes talk about the Norse diaspora, which is this idea of a culture that has connections. It has a heartland or heartlands, in this case, Scandinavia, as we think of it, so Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. But then it spreads out. And the point of it spreading out is it's an outward-facing movement, but they still are aware of being connected to each other and to a whole, and they share a language. Yes, there'll be dialects, but by the time you get to the furthest reaches of that world, so they go all the way across the North Atlantic, they settle Iceland in around 871, that sort of time. They've reached and settled Greenland just before the start of the new millennium, so around 985. They even reach the edge of the North American continent, but they don't settle there. And in the same way, they go in the opposite direction. They go east, down the Eurasian steppes and waterways, the lands that are now sort of Ukraine, Russia, all the way to Byzantium and Constantinople, which is sort of, the glittering heart of Byzantium as an empire, and even to the Islamic Caliphate. So you've got to think of this big cultural sphere.
What time period are we in exactly? Scandinavia was a part of what we call the Roman Iron Age until about 400 CE, when the Western Roman Empire began to disintegrate. Small tribes and clans popped up in the region and migrated often until a major geological event occurred in the 530s. Two massive volcanic eruptions happened, one in 536 and one in 539. They were of an unprecedented magnitude. We're talking top 10 largest eruptions on Earth over the past 7,000 years. The eruptions caused a dust veil in the Earth's atmosphere, which meant that the light of the sun was literally blocked by a hazy mist created by the ejecta and sulfur dioxide. No sun meant, you guessed it, no heat. Trees withered, crops failed, temperatures plummeted. Acid rain polluted the lakes and rivers, snow fell in the summer. It was a real-life version of Queen Elsa causing eternal winter. Fun times had by all. And the effects were felt everywhere. We have historical sources from North America, Europe, China, and India all describing this event, which have been confirmed by volcanologists and historical climate modelers alike. But the effects were especially deadly in Scandinavia, where, even in the best of times, it's freaking cold. Tens of thousands of Scandinavians starved to death due to the Fimbulwinter, or Mighty Winter, as they called it. When it was over, around 50% of the population was gone. For comparison, the Black Death is said to have killed around 45 to 60% of Europe. Recovering from this event took centuries, as the Prose Edda tells us.
First of all, a winter will come called Fimbulwinter. Then snow will drift from all directions. There will then be great frost and keen winds. The sun will do no good.
There's a reason the Vikings were always described as strong, tall, and hardy. They had to be. They were the survivors. It was around 750 CE that certain military elites began consolidating power amongst these survivors, kicking off what we now call the Viking Age. It was also around then that they started jumping on their ships and going raiding, introducing themselves rather bloodily to other cultures. The Vikings would seize land in Europe, the British Isles, and as far afield as Russia, Byzantium, and the Islamic Caliphate. They would become kings and infiltrate royal bloodlines. Modern studies have shown that some 1/4 of Scots in our era have some Viking DNA. Their power starts to break and taper around 1050 CE, but their legacy would come to outlast them all. So let's say we've landed in 950 CE in the heart of Viking country. We're in what historians call the early Middle Ages, or more commonly, the Dark Age. It's been about 430 years since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and we're about 200 years away from Melisende becoming Queen of Outremer over in the Crusader states. We Vikings have gotten very into raiding, infiltrating places like France, and soon one of our leaders will discover Greenland. It's feeling very early medieval up in here. Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty, we need to get a general picture of our lives as Norse people. A scaffolding, if you will, to wrap our heads around. We are very dependent on the sea, and maritime travel is vitally important to us. The landscape of Scandinavia in the age of the Vikings is very different than it is in our day. There's much more water, as the glaciers have melted to create hundreds of fjords, rivers, and lakes. So it's quite common for the Vikings to travel by boat in places that are now extremely inland. In Norway, most of the year is spent in deep snow, and mountain ranges dominate the landscape, so the majority of farms are on the coast. Sweden features rolling hills covered in impassable forests, and so most people live on riverbanks. In Denmark, with its low-lying lakes, bogs, and marshes, boat travel is really how we get around. The majority of Vikings aren't soldiers but farmers. Yes, we travel and sail and do the raiding, and we'll get to all of that, never you fear. But our day-to-day lives are much less glamorous than certain television shows might have us believe. Now it's time to talk about our social structure. At the very end of the Viking Age, we'll start to see the rise of kings, who will try to centralize their rule, but they often declare victory prematurely. For example, in the 870s, a guy fetchingly named Harald Finehair will declare himself King of Norway, when, in actuality, the local chiefs hold the real power until the 10th century. In 958, King Harald Bluetooth claims to have won for himself all of Denmark and Norway. But then his son rebels, and Harald is killed in the ensuing civil war. The growth of actual kingdoms in Scandinavia goes hand in hand with the spread of Christianity, which won't really take hold until the end of the Viking Age, when civil wars amongst would-be kings will rage. Instead, the majority of the Viking Age is ruled by local chieftains and warlords, who basically act as kings on a much smaller scale. Bow down, local peasants! Before the Fimbulwinter, lots of people had tiny plots of land, and society was much more equitable. After the Fimbulwinter, a few men took advantage of all the abandoned land and seized it by force. Thus, land is now in the hands of a powerful few, not the many, and these men dole it out in the form of tenancy. Tenants receive the land from these men and are given the right to farm there, but they also have to give the landowner a portion of their crops, livestock, or resources as a form of rent. Indentured servitude, here we come. Thus, landowners tend to be wealthy and powerful, becoming the chieftains and warlords of their small communities. These men consolidate their power by building great halls and estates, and their people come to pay fealty. Most importantly, they can afford to keep a small band of loyal warriors. They invite promising young men from important families to come swear an oath and pledge to fight for them, and in exchange, these men are rewarded with gifts, land, and the opportunity to make names for themselves on raids. In other words, your chieftain makes it possible for you to live pretty high on the hog some of the time, but you'd better come when that boy calls. These chieftains and warlords really rule society. Just below them are the jarls and earls, the warrior nobles who serve them, often by helping them absorb the territories of their rivals. Small battles are common as lords constantly play power games and try to weed out the competition. At the beginning of the Viking Age, there are at least 30 different chieftains, but soon there are only around a dozen, all vying to become the one king. Under the jarls and earls are the carls, the free farmers who make up the bulk of society, and who work as tenants. Finally, there are the thralls, or the slaves, at the very bottom of the rung. Many of these people were kidnapped on raids abroad. Finding free labor is often the main goal of a Viking raiding party. Not a particularly cute fact, but here we are. Since the Vikings are farmers, land means money, and money means power. So land ownership and inheritance rights matter, and one of the primary functions of runestones is to record inheritance rights. Annoyingly, land always passes through the male line, and men are given preference. But, by law, women can inherit land in the absence of male relatives. Additionally, if a piece of land has been owned by members of the same family for more than 6 generations, their heirs have an unalienable right to it, and it can't be sold elsewhere. This law protects the inheritance rights of daughters as well, allowing them to keep the land rather than have to turn it over to male family members outside the immediate circle. Downton Abbey's Lady Mary would have loved it. Indeed, many female Viking skeletons have been found in graves marked with earthen mounds, which symbolizes that they once owned land. And you know what? We love this for them. What does the Viking Age justice system look like? The culture of the Norse is very much one of reciprocity and honor. An eye for an eye, so to speak. If you kill someone, it's perfectly fine and even expected for a family or clan member to kill you in revenge. Drama! And then your family will probably kill them, and on and on. Seems like kind of a waste to me. In the sagas, chieftains are often called in to put a stop to bloody vendetta cycles in which whole families are wiped out. They try to mediate interpersonal conflicts and convince people to accept blood money rather than jumping straight to murder to solve every supposed slight. This culture of violence being totally acceptable, and even encouraged, means that a justice system is very necessary to make sure society doesn't crumble. That is where the thing comes in, though in Old Norse the term is actually ping. The thing is a regularly scheduled gathering of local elected representatives, the Viking equivalent of your local town hall meeting. Things are so important that a special meeting place is built just to house them. A number of longhouse-type structures arranged in a horseshoe shape around a courtyard or central space. These structures are temporary houses for the delegates, who travel there specifically for these meetings. The site is usually chosen to be slightly out of the way to prevent someone from bringing their clan and bullying the delegates into swinging their way. The thing is a place to resolve matters peacefully, and the area is guarded when meetings are in session. The delegates of the thing serve as both politicians and court, making decisions on everything from trying to resolve a petty quarrel about land between neighbors to capital crimes like murder. Delegates are usually powerful landowning members of the community and are often accompanied by a spokesman, someone from their town who's particularly good at public speaking, like a skald. These speeches are heard by the law speaker, who presides over the things and acts as the official judge in all matters, although sometimes he asks for the opinions of other delegates. The law speaker is an extremely important position, as he's charged with memorizing and reciting laws. Although there are certainly certain laws written down on runestones, the majority of the legal code doesn't exist anywhere except in the law speaker's memory. This sounds deeply suspicious to our modern ears, but honor and trust are so deeply ingrained amongst the Vikings that no one thinks twice about the possibility of him bending the law as he sees fit. If a matter can't be resolved at one thing, it moves up to a higher thing to be debated by a more powerful group of delegates covering a larger territory. Clearly, the Vikings are trying for some semblance of democracy and fairness. It's not a perfectly equitable system, as the more powerful and wealthy your family is, the more likely you'll have influence among the delegates, but at least it mostly keeps feuds in check. Okay, finally, where are my ladies at? What is our role in this society? Like so many things about this time and culture, it's a bit hard to define.
It's really hard to say unilaterally what was a woman's role in the Viking Age. I mean, we're talking 300 or 400 years. We're talking about a culture that spans from Greenland to Kiev, at least, and probably farther.
And while so much about ladies in Viking culture remains something of a mystery, this society is a lot more egalitarian than we might think. A lot of what we know about women's roles comes from the sagas, which were written by a Christian misogynist who often painted ambitious women in a somewhat unflattering light. Our old friend Snorri was deeply Christian. He subscribed to the medieval view that women were either Mary or Eve, honored mothers or objects of lust and destruction. But he also mentions Norse myths that take a different view of the matter.
In the beginning, according to the Norse story, there were 2 driftwood logs, one elm tree and one ash tree, found on the seashore by 3 wandering gods. These gods give the wood human shape, and they bring it to life with blood, breath, and curious minds. That's all he tells us. But unlike the Christian creation myth, we can see that where Eve was an afterthought fashioned out of Adam's rib, in the Norse myth, the female, Embla, the elm, and Asker, the male, are equal. They are made at the same time out of nearly the same stuff. They are as different as an ash tree and an elm tree. And they make a good team because an ash tree was used for spears and oars of a ship. An elm tree was used for wagon wheels and for bows. Made a very good strong bow. So both of these woods had uses both in peacetime and in wartime. They were adapted to their strengths.
The Norse think of men and women as different but equal. Each is useful and powerful in their own way. Skill matters a whole lot more than gender here. Gender isn't even one of society's real dividing lines.
The list that I come up with is that roles were based on ambition, on ability, on family ties, and on wealth. So your status mattered, your family mattered, but also who you were mattered.
We have this vision of Viking men as raiders and Viking women, other than the odd warrior, as homemakers. But we have plenty of reasons to believe this isn't true.
If you look back at, again, the Norse mythology and the stories that Snorri left out, you will find that he gives us the names of women, goddesses, that he doesn't tell us stories about. But these are lawyers, they are doctors, they are judges, they are queens, they are war leaders, they are messengers, they are scribes, they are poets, they are seers, they are, witches, ritual performers. There's all kinds of women hiding in the myths that he doesn't tell us stories about, and that we can only guess that they really were there.
In Hervor's song, a warrior woman says, "You've done well, father, to give me your sword. I'd rather have it than rule all of Norway." This line suggests to us that Viking women can be warriors, but it also implies they can rule. And you know what? They do. Norse law suggests so anyway.
In one of the sagas very early, when the Althing is being established in 930, they make a law that women can no longer be chieftains. So women were chieftains before 930 at least.
When Tacitus, a Roman, travels to Sweden in the 1st century, he writes scathingly,
"So notoriously do they degenerate not only from a state of liberty, but even below a state of bondage. Here the sovereignty is exercised by a woman."
The thing is, sweet baby Tacitus, all a Viking ruler has to be is smart and merciless, regardless of whether or not they have a disco stick. We have plenty of archaeological evidence that back up such stories.
Women who were buried as landowners and women who are buried as members of the chieftain's retinue, they can sex those graves. Some of them have weapons. You've got men buried with cooking equipment, buried with keys. So what, are they housewives because they have keys? The archaeologist who did that work, she says that the Kaupang burials speak very clearly of a society where gender was unlikely to have been a determining factor in choice of occupation or status.
It's important to remember that the Viking patriarchy is not the Victorian-era patriarchy. Yes, the laws tend to favor men, as we will see. But we should go ahead and forget the whole concept of separate spheres.
This is where our prejudices and our biases have sort of settled into this concept of what the Viking Age was like. And when we peel off all the Victorian, sort of attitudes and look at, well, what do we really know? Pretty much it looks like an egalitarian society. It does to me.
Gender roles in Viking society are more fluid because, well, they have to be. Men have to figure out how to clean and feed themselves without their womenfolk to do it for them while they're traveling. Women have to learn how to work and defend themselves. But women don't always stay at home. There's evidence they also go a-raiding. Some of them are buried as warriors, which we'll talk about at length in future. This is a culture of strong, independent, assertive women, unafraid to speak their minds.
We have to look beyond what we were taught about the Viking Age. We have to look beyond what's in the books, the historical novels that we love, the fantasy novels that we love, the TV programs that we love, and say, okay, that's a great story, but what does it have to do with history? What does that have to do with what people's lives were really like back then? And why do we continue to tell that story?
In our next episode, we'll find out more about the roles we ladies play in the Viking Age. We'll learn from some of the queens of the era about relationships, marriage, and power. For our patrons, we'll also have the full interview with Eleanor Barraclough. There's so much in there I couldn't fit into the series, and it's truly excellent. And the story of Brynhild the Valkyrie, straight from the sagas. Welcome to the Viking Age, listeners. Until next time. Thanks for listening. If you dig the Exploress, and I hope you do, tell a friend about it, and leave me a rating and review wherever you listen. This really helps like-minded listeners find the show. Special thanks to Eleanor Barraclough and Nancy Marie Brown. You can find links to their books in the show notes. Thank you times a million to Carly Quinn, my co-creator, for her work researching and writing this series. To Joshua Stackhouse for my theme music, and Mr. Exploress, aka Paul Gablonsky, for my logo. The music in this episode is by Solas composer and Kevin Macleod. And thank you to the following for their vocal stylings: John Armstrong and Melee.